ADANIA Shibli, čuvena palestinska spisateljica koja će nam uz pomoć Johna Freemana, američkog pisca, urednika i naravno prijatelja Bookstana, navesti koji sporedan detalj o svojoj uspješnici Sporedan detalj, a ja ću dodati samo 3. Znači, knjiga je bila prošle godine nominirana za Bookerovu nagradu. Na bosanski je knjigu preveo profesor arapske književnosti Mirza Sarajkić i nakon razgovora dobrodošli u knjižaru da dobijete i svoj primjerak. Izvolite.
Thank you. Thank you, Lamija and Damar, for being open to the suggestion of bringing ADANIA Shibli to Saudi. Independence of language from subject, like in poetry, where it kind of moves like a kite in the wind. And it created this intense inner geography, which is a term that Anton Shamas has used to describe your work, that it creates these intense inner geographies. And I would add that it allows for abstract states of being to come into great, immense clarity, full of their own word music and punctuated as if by a linguistic angel. No one punctuates a sentence as beautifully and robustly as ADANIA does, which is really on major display in Minor Detail, which is a short novel in 2 parts, the first part of which unfolds in the Naqab in August of 1949, when a group of young Israeli Defense Force men on patrol commit an atrocious rape and murder of a young Bedouin girl. The head of this group, who's an unnamed man, proceeds with his work up until this point with a silent fury bedeviled by wind and insects and heat and sand and a putrefying wound he gets from a bug bite. And then this crime happens. And in the second half, a woman born 25 years to the day after this terrible event reads an article in an Israeli newspaper about the crime, phones up the journalist who wrote the article, and using a borrowed ID, because as a Palestinian woman, her freedom of movement is restricted by the Israeli government, she drives in disguise toward the site of the crime through a series of Byzantine checkpoints, reroutings, paralyzed by fear and confusion. And eventually she passes into new roads as they enter territory claimed by Israel, passing renamed villages and others vanished entirely from the map, on towards an IDF military museum, which tells a very different story about how that landscape came to be, and a settlement in Nirim, where she has to disguise herself to talk to a local historian. And what she seeks, she's not really sure what she wants. She wants information, but as she drives, the landscape around her gives her a constant warning that it's almost certainly impossible to get any true or clear information about what has happened long ago. I wanted to give you this very detailed description because this is a mesmerizing novel of surpassing beauty. And I think the best part to begin is just to describe how you create these immense effects, these interior states in the language itself, ADANIA. The first thing I notice in the very first sentence is no one in the first part is named. It's the man, it's the Bedouin girl, it's the other soldier, it's the guard. The date is named. What does that deprival of information produce in the story from the very beginning?
It's better. It works better if it's on. Yeah, before answering your question, I really would like to thank you for noting the punctuation, because I spend a lot of time. Sometimes I go sleeping and it was a comma, and then in the morning should be a comma or a dot. And you know, I go on for 3 days with this, tortured, but I think nobody will notice, but thank you for noticing this. Naming, I think naming is always for me, is actually an act of power when you name. And it's a question also, taking names away is a deletion. So I think I approach language from, I can kind of separate between being Palestinian and writing, but sometimes my relation to language, or how I come to language, is very much determined by how I discovered language. I think language is there for all of us, but we all have our own way to language. And I realized from a very young age, an early age, that naming is a massive act of power. I think, for instance, like the first thing as a kid you notice when you open the atlas and you see all the names of these countries, and then suddenly you come where you think Palestine is, but the name is not there. And this moment, I think this is the first, almost the first, almost primal scene in language. This is the first moment you realize, okay, language is something that hides and doesn't reveal, and you have your place in it that is not necessarily articulated. And then it comes also, as kids we used to go to places. We used to have picnic, but not a picnic in the sense like, the middle class bourgeois people going on a picnic. We go to pick up wild plants and sometimes grapes and olives and figs. And as kids, we were going to these landscapes that they are called Ashajara, Bisan, Sirin. But we never see these names on the road signs. But our parents, they tell us we're going there, and we go to pick up these fruits that later you realize they are the fruits of those who became refugees. Because the trees didn't become refugees, the trees were not expelled, maybe they were uprooted, but some fruit trees, they remain there, and those who remain sort of started to take care of them. Because you need to take care of the fruits, otherwise they become rotten, and then the trees almost die. So this is almost like the act of those who remain taking care of a memory through a care of a tree. But when you go to these places, they are not names. You have all the road signs of other names, of the new Israeli settlements or whatever is there. So there's almost like language and naming becomes this parallel that you know you are living in your fantasy. It's almost in your imagination. So you go and you see reality doesn't reveal this language, doesn't reveal these names. And it's almost maybe the first act of, you realize imagination also is not an act of entertainment, but it's almost survival. You need that to survive. But you remain with a sensitivity of who calls what. And I think I'm haunted by that. Who am I to call my characters by a name? I'm really careful. I know that I can do anything to them. I can describe anything about them, but not their names. Unless, sometimes there is a name, but the name, it has to be really crucial to this moment. So I think it's there. If I try to think, why am I always afraid of naming? I think beyond naming my son, I didn't name anything.
ADANIA has a lot of registers in her writing style. I published a story in Freeman's, which had a kind of robust, almost realistic, mid-19th century bulging Naguib Mahfouz feel, about a bus, owner of a bus line that was sort of trying to navigate through various political shenanigans. I read a story of yours called Silence, in which there's a young girl who I think is deaf, and you describe the silences around her. It was an immensely sensuous and beautiful detail. This book, it's very hard not to compare the two prose styles, because in the first, this unnamed military, I think, major or officer. Virtually every sentence describes an action. His action is not impeded. The sentences are fairly short. There's very little interiority. There's sensation, as in he smells things, he's repulsed by things. These spiders get into his tent, and one bites him, and then he's trying to kill the others. But nothing impedes his agency in the world, and the sentences reflect that. There are 2 or 3 clauses, sometimes 4 or 5 when he starts to get agitated and does a bunch of things. But in the second half, the woman, as she is trying to get to the source of information, there are these long sentences with 10, 12, 14 clauses in which her interactions produce these states of high anxiety where she's almost paralyzed by fear. And I want you to, I guess, talk a little bit about if there was a narrative strategy about these 2 styles, or if you were simply following, the first 2 couple words you put down and seeing where they went.
Yeah, well, actually, sometimes I reach a text after many years of asking something. And my question was in the last few years of how stories are told. I mean, we have the stories that they have clarity, and where almost they are complete, almost like a photograph, where you never can doubt something exists beyond them, the reality. And I have a problem with this kind of narrative. It's the narrative that tells everything, or what we think it tells everything. It almost closes any other possibility there's a different story. And I find this is the narrative of those, again, speaking about power, those who can master things. The mastery of this narrative structure with a beginning, a middle, and an end, calmness, and, almost perfection. And I always thought that, I trust in the broken language, and the scars and the wounds in language, and the narrative of things we never can say, things we would never want to say, things, like how can you approach silence within writing, and if you trust in silence as equally as you trust in language, but how you can give a place to that. So for me, the second part is almost kind of trying to honor silence by the opposite, by somebody who's constantly anxious, but with this anxiety, you see that there's something is not being touched. There's this silence. Whereas the first part, it is completion that almost deletes a possibility of silence. Everything is said, and everything somehow doesn't tell you there's something hidden. So it's a question like, how can literature reveal silence? Because we are always being asked, and I think this is a question of what happens if we want to write the things we never want to say. And there's also another element to these 2 parts. I don't only approach writing from a very serious, haunting question. I do that, but there's always a joke. Every text I reach it because there's a joke. And this actually, I know it's not a joke, it's a serious book. It's a sad book sometimes. But I reached it because of a joke, and I would like to share this joke. So the joke is about somebody who's stuttering. He goes to the bus, to take the bus, and rides the bus, and gets to the bus driver and says, how much is the ticket? The bus driver says, it's like say, 2 euros. And that guy pays the ticket and goes on the bus. And then somebody else comes on the bus and says, hello, how much is the ticket? And the bus driver says, it's 2 euros. And this guy goes back so angry and says, you were making fun of me. And the bus driver says, no, 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 I was making fun of him. And so for me, you know, if I think I am a person who is stuttering, whose language is filled with holes and scars and these deletions I was referring to earlier, can I ever imitate those who speak perfectly, you know? And that's also the first part. It is these short sentences, the calm ones. Whereas maybe the second part is more coming with the spirit of the stuttering. But is it possible? I mean, I don't know. Is really the bus driver making fun of those who speak perfectly? Can I do that? Or are we all have this power with us? I don't know.
Well, your second character, the woman in the second half, does stutter. And she stutters at one of the checkpoints, and that is a point of anxiety for the reader. But the effect of the first section, which is smooth and unbroken, the characters isn't self-reflexive, is it produces the effect that he feels unwatched, that he does all these things, and he's sort of in his tent, and he takes his pants off, and he washes his wound, and he soaps his face, and he soaps his groin. And the first 20 pages of the book are basically descriptions of this, as in the desert, being alone, and being alone within his tent. And so we have this feeling as readers that we're in an unwatched realm, which eventually has catastrophic consequences for this Bedouin girl that they come upon. And I'm just curious how you wrote your way into that state of mind, because one of the first words in the first sentence is the word mirage, you know, and this is a book very much about land, and maps are texts. Maps are documents of desire, you know, and I feel like this book is very much a book about the way desire and land are wrapped up together in the region that this man is sort of taking over with the other troops. And I guess I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of writing around to the other side of the mirage.
Yeah, I mean, we go back to the stutterer who tries to imitate those who speak perfectly. Does it work? Or maybe actually it's, when I was writing that part, I mean, also the writing process, you are not so much conscious. It's not like you're almost a decision, but it's like playing. You play, you position yourself in a place that you allow yourself maybe to approach language and sensibility in this way of the powerful. And it's very interesting because at a certain moment, the question was for me, it's not about him being an other, but it's also the possibility in us, all of us, to commit a crime and to normalize that crime. I mean, this is, for me, exactly by approaching this character, it is also approaching a possibility that is not impossible in us. It probably lies there, the moment that we can become criminals and not only the perpetrators and the victims. And I should confess, I'm always extremely worried as a person, but also in writing, like what kind of language I'm using that might position me in a place that normalizes crime. And this is a daily question, even in personal relations. I mean, even in love relations, like sometimes how we treat others who are very close to us. Or it's a question of creating pain. And normally we can cause pain by language. It is our mean of intimacy, but also it is a way of I mean, it's hard, but it can cause pain without us noticing that. So I think it was also for me an approach to something within me capable of, or the possibility of committing or causing pain to somebody else.
Yeah, the escalation of the first part is not, we don't meet a monster and then think, okay, what's he going to do? We meet someone who's kind of alone, or alone with a group of other men, and a series of happenstance interactions. He gets bit by a bug. He gets progressively more agitated, physically agitated, and then in the course of trying to patrol certain region, comes upon this woman and her dog, and the dog is barking, and the barking is making people agitated and angry, and the girl smells, and it becomes another object that he has to deal with in a series of objectified, abstract tasks. And I don't, assuming you'll read some of this, and then it comes to the moment where he has to make a decision, because several men have gone into this girl's tent and done something to her. And he says, we either all have to do something, and what's the other option?
To have her work in the kitchen.
To have her work in the kitchen. And they almost immediately make the worst decision. And it's really, really harrowing, because you know from that moment on that this girl is kind of doomed. And I wonder if you can, were you inspired by any actual events like this, or are you imagining something that probably has happened many times over? And if it's the latter, how do you situate that imagining in your sort of moral life as a writer?
I mean, the question of reality is always there. Like when you write about a chair or a table, like there's a real chair or table. But for me, really, I know it might sound a bit weird, but for me, language is never related to a reality. And I think this book is playing with that. We have no access to reality. We only have access to language that we think it's related to reality, and we want to force it into that. It is a question of probably the normalcy of not only death, but the impossibility of us getting to hear the dead, or to have an access to their language and to their existence. I mean, I don't know how to say it, but for me, it's sometimes as if like, going to the news, and the character is saying that she read a news item. But again, a news item is a news item. It's not a story, the actual experience. We will never have access to that. And there's news stories that constantly are there. And it's because for me, the question of death is something I cannot approach in reality. It's too much for us to be able to approach this in reality, or something to relate to reality. I think it's an impossibility. We have, once we die, we don't, we cannot delegate this responsibility to anybody else, I think. Or we expect ourselves, we're taking the responsibility of the day to speak about them, for them, and their place, on their behalf. It's an impossible. It is really the question of how we who are alive, we can, with our possibility of life, can relate to the dead. And it's always by speaking about the dead. And I don't want to speak about anybody. And I think the character doesn't want to speak about anybody. So it is a trace, it's trying to trace. But when you make this trace, you don't do it in reality. You do it to yourself in a certain way, and actually, if you're the victim, either you're going to commit the crime, if you're going to trace, because, I put it differently, because when there's a crime scene, you never hear the victim who was killed. We always have the criminal or the perpetrator who shows us the traces of his crime or her crime. We go with them. So this is the perspective of the perpetrator. And this is by narration, you know, and this is like, they confess, the criminals. We have the reports written about them. So it's only through language, and I think language is very important in these cases, because we think it's the real, but it's nothing about the real. The real is beyond our access. And so for me, it's never a question that this is a real event. No, it is what remains beyond the real. And this is the character. So of course, I mean, if you want to follow the perpetrator, either you commit the crime and then you're narrating this, or you're a victim again. And I mean, this novel, who was, you know, the second part. I mean, I don't want to tell you more, but it is also a question of is it a live person, a person alive, or a person who's dead? But it's again saying it's a question of fiction. So I never, for me, I'm really removing it from any reality. We cannot claim that we are inspired by the real. If we are inspired by the impossibility of the real, that we don't have access to that. We hear about deaths, and we hear about killings, and we hear about rapes in these situations. And it's only we hear the words. And therefore, it is, I would say, an inspiration by narration, nothing about reality. And I wouldn't ever claim that I have access or have a desire to uncover something in the real.
Yeah, one of the striking aspects of the second part of the book is every time that the character encounters an official version of history, even us within the realm of the novel know that it's distorted. And so it's sliding the historical rug out from beneath us, even while we're inside the created history of the novel. I want to sort of...
Yeah, you know, I want to continue about that, because you know, after I finished the novel, and we were working with the editor in London, the translation, and when I was going home, he gave me a magazine, and the magazine, there was an interview with Saidiya Hartman. And it's fascinating because she's a historian and trying to actually ask, how can we trust history if history includes the deletion of all others who have been deleted, you know? For instance, if we take the stories of those who were kidnapped and enslaved from the African continent, but they never made the trip to North America, and they drowned. So what kind of narrative we have? And I think it's not history, it is only narration through imagination, because we never have access to that reality. And then where she comes to fabulation, I'm not saying like history is, I'm denying history, but I'm saying history is limited. And especially it's limited to those who don't trust in language. It's not that they don't have access to language. I mean, I just brought the example of us growing in a landscape that is haunted by names that they don't exist, but we live almost this parallel life. And this is, I'm not going to deny this as a reality, but it is a reality that allows an imagination, and this imagination is it's what you live on as well. So it's more than the real. The real, this kind of scientific, objective, it is those who are forcing reality on the ground, and they try to tell you there's one narrative. And this is fascinating in terms of literature, that it's not about history. It's almost kind of, you know, living history. It's almost like, you know, as if we are sleepwalkers, we are narrating history through our sleep. And this is, for me, that's the moment of not hallucination, but allowing that which has been deleted. It's almost like speaking in the tongue or in a language that does not say there is a story for those who are alive. No, there is a place for those who have been deleted. And yeah.
The book that ADANIA mentioned, Wayward Lives by Saidiya Hartman, is if you're at all interested in sort of the last century of American history, is brilliantly fascinating, because she basically takes the lives of sort of women who were queer, who were robustly sexual, whose lives didn't fit the model of women at the time, especially black women, and who were therefore criminalized and either suppressed or killed, deleted from the historical record because they didn't suit the narrative that was developing out of the time. And I want to sort of move sideways via your, no doubt, robust intellectual technology that you learned in media studies, because we're here in Sarajevo, and Susan Sontag's On Photography was written in 1977, and she wrote that book basically coming to the conclusion that the images would be emptied of meaning because they didn't produce any kind of sense of reality and connection with real life. And then she came here during the siege, and her reaction after that was to write on the suffering of others, I think, on regarding the pain of others, which was a repudiation of on photography to some degree, and came to the conclusion that it was possible through seeing, a disembodied image from another place to connect with a reality that it wouldn't. She didn't go so far as to claim empathy was possible, but that some imagination of the suffering of others was possible. And I guess this is a long-winded way of asking you if your belief in language and its separation from reality bears any connection to your experience of growing up in an occupied territory in which any number of films and photographs and journalistic reports have been unable to produce a significant critical mass of awareness to change the actuality of the reality, or even imagine the reality that you've experienced yourself while living there.
Yeah, I mean, I want to give you go to another example. When also the first time I realized the power of narration and what it can delete from reality, and it's not related. So I had a fight with my sister. She's like 4 years older than me. She really hit me, yeah? She hit me, and we were playing, and so she hit me, and she ran away to my mom crying that I hit her. And I was like, what? Like, how could this? So I was going, I was following her to see how she's gonna tell the story to my mom, how that I hit her when she hit me. And because I was like, wow, so fascinated how she can invent such a story with so many details, and then and I was like, oh, I cannot understand. I was fascinated by this ability, and she was pointing to my mom. You see, she's even speechless because all I said was true. And then, of course, I was punished because I couldn't bring a different story. And this is, I think, like. If we go to this telling what happened, and I witnessed that. I mean, it's not only in studying and having the media studies, but also working with the media. And I think you see how a narrative, like normally the press is not like going to cover what's in there. It's mainly, there is an understanding, a previous understanding that sometimes it goes to fit into what you think the others know, and you would like to give that and to imagine you got the story. So you have, like, I don't know, not sometimes this report 3 minutes, and 3 minutes you want to cover how somebody got killed or a child and so forth. There was a specific example which I remember that, and I remember the same speechlessness that I witnessed when I was a kid. The Queen of Sweden, out of all places, she started to condemn Palestinian mothers for sending their kids to death. That was in the Intifada in the early 2000s. I was working with a Swedish TV, and as a fixer, translator, producer, whatever. You do all these things, and so the journalist asked me, can you find a mother whose kid got killed? And to ask her this question. yeah, and they're like, and at these times you don't think about that. So there's the Queen of Sweden. She says something about Palestinian mothers. I don't know if she would know where's Palestine on the map, but probably we assume she knows. But you know, the Swedish journalist would like to approve that knowledge, and I didn't go on that with them on that trip, but I arranged for them to meet this woman. I said, no, you know, in such that it's impossible. There is a kid who was injured, but by the time that the team arrived to the mother, the kid died. And so we had the rushes. So they came back in the evening, and they asked her the question, do Palestinian mothers send their kids to death? And the mother looks at him like, what is this? And she tells him, like, you know, an animal doesn't do that. Like, what do you think? And then he asked the question differently. But, you know, Palestinian kids are getting killed. She says, yeah, the military. So her son was going to school. He was shot with a bullet. It's called the 400 bullet, which can reach you know, 2 kilometers. And the boy he was going, it's like, you know, it kind of this reached him. So he's not even close to a demonstration or whatever. But they omit this part of the story. And then they hear one part where this is like almost a sentence of coping with that. So she says, but of course we sacrifice everything for Palestine. We sacrifice our lands, we sacrifice our selves, we sacrifice our kids. And within all of this, the rushes are about 1 hour and a half. And the report that is 3 minutes, they take the part, yes, we sacrifice our children. And, you know, and this, yeah, you know, I actually did my, later my master's about that, because I could have access to the material. And you can see how she's trying to evade. But then this is like, you know, how media, it's not like everybody's bad, but it is, you know, the Israelis, they propose something. Then the queen says something. And then these media are within this discourse, within this conversation, and they're looking, and it's almost like a trap. So you can, this kind of fact of how, there where I don't trust, like, you know, and maybe one image can make you understand the suffering of others. But there's one image that also justifies the suffering of others. And for me, it's not like, so how can I trust that? If we go back to history, if history is responsible for a deletion of something, can you trust history? Can I trust images as representing something? No, I know that these images are actually a produce of ideas that are there before. And they are not necessarily related to reality. And this is also, you know, I keep thinking about this mother. I actually was haunted, and I called the journalist, and the journalist, when he knew that I was doing my research, I told him I'm doing the research, he called me and he said, I know I did a mistake. I told him, don't worry, I'm not gonna do anything against you, I'm just writing my research. Because he knew that I got all the rushes. And we can see through this material. And this is happening. So what I prefer to think this is something not related to reality. Reality, we choose. It's not only this bad journalists or whatever, but we are so much editing. Like now we can hear something that corresponds or relate to something else. It's almost this kind of the element of there's so much in the world, and we take parts of it. So I think we should confess that there's so much, and we're just taking one part. Not that part we are taking is the reality. And that's why I insist that the book is literature. I don't claim that it relates to any reality. You know, maybe it plays with reality. Like, you know, we kind of, like kids, you know, we twist it a little bit. It could be, you know, language, you can say a he or a she or a they, but it remains within that game. Yeah.
Some of the things you've just spoken reiterate some ideas that Rabia Alameddin said when he came here a couple years ago for the same festival, where he said one of his biggest challenges in writing was to get around preconceived emotions about certain topics. And his first novel, Kool-Aids, was about the Civil War in Beirut and AIDS. And so he decided to make it a very funny book, obviously, partly to sort of constantly break people out of preconceived emotions. And later in the book, as the second character is driving around, there's ultimately a kind of discourse at some point about German expressionism and how it emerged as a mode of not representing reality, but representing, let's just call it the experience of experience, as a better stand-in for what the quarry is here. And in some ways, to me, it felt like a little key to the book, and that this book is almost modernist in its style, and it's the way it elides away from any attempt to map it onto reality. And in terms of my experience of reading Palestinian literature, the only book I could think of that it reminded me of was Ghassan Kanafani's Men in the Sun. And I wonder if, as a Palestinian woman writing in 2022, if there were other beacons for you in how to find your own way to write about the experience of experience now, if he was one of them, or if any other people from anywhere were guide points for you.
You know, actually, my name shouldn't be on this book because it's plagiarized. It's so many people wrote this book. I'm just like, you know, walking around, listening, taking things. Actually, also, the characters are inspired by paintings, by expressionist paintings, like two main things. And that's why also what I'm saying, that there's the claim that there's an individual writer writing a book. This is also a modern idea. It's this way we just do it to have the money, you know. But I think everybody should share, you know, share some of the, because this is the fascinating thing about language. Everybody is using it, and sometimes you just hear. So for me, the inspiration is from everybody. Even like sometimes, you know, people. Like leaving some notes behind, leaving, even writing shopping lists is inspiring. So, yeah, I truly love language. And I love the people's way to language. Like almost, we have this thing that is for us all, but each one have their own weight towards language. And this is for me a game. This is an ongoing game. Sometimes that it's the spoken, but it's also when it's written, it has forms. So I don't differentiate. I mean, of course, I read a lot of literature. I love literature. I read a lot, but it's not only literature. I love also reading, you know, these manuals for how to, the fridge, and you know, all this stuff, because it's fascinating, like how this, it's almost like a dead language, how you can make language dead, and it's, you know, how to use a fridge, a toaster. It's like, nobody cares about it. It's beautiful. You know, there's some, and you know, when I had my vaccination, you know, to read these 7 pages in Arabic about the vaccination, you know, I had my vaccination in Germany, so of course, you know, what's they called, this company, the German company, I forgot, not Moderna, the BioNTech. I mean, of course, they had lots of money, so they employed very good translator and very good editor. And you read this BioNTech explanation of the vaccination, like it's beauty, it's linguistic beauty. What I mean, it's like there's always sometimes a way into language that is present. It's like you can find it everywhere. So I try to read. I don't want to go only and read these classics. Of course, I love James Joyce. He's wonderful. Not only wonderful, it's like, you know, I live on that. There's Lispector, there's like all this, but also all these writers, when they are translated into Arabic, there's the beauty of how it's almost Arabic language opens itself to a different sensibility. suddenly, you know, even when I was a kid, like reading Tolstoy or Dostoevsky in Arabic, wow, this is like what happens to Arabic suddenly? Because we read this poetry from the 6th century or the 7th century, the Mu'allaqat, which is very, very serious, and suddenly you have like this different text. So it opens up, and it's almost like each time there's something new. And I would say, like, with this love to language, you cannot come and tell a kid which chocolate you like or which sweets you prefer. I like them all. I love everything, you know. I cannot, I'm too greedy.
You also speak, I think you speak about 6 languages.
I learned, I don't speak them perfectly. I don't speak any language perfectly.
But I think it was, obviously this is impressive because you're conducting this in your 3rd or 4th language, because you speak Arabic, some German, French, English, obviously, bien sûr, and Korean? Yeah. Okay, explain Korean. Where did that come in? Is that just like a hobby?
No.
Love?
No.
Travel?
I had a residency, but it's also great. Korean language, what you learn in Korean language. This is also, what's nice about learning other languages, it also makes you relate to language differently. So in Korean, you only have I, you, and we. It's very rude to say I, and it's impolite to say you. So the only noun they use is we. So really, honestly, it's not our book, our water, our wife, our children, our home. Everything is our. And it's amazing. And also what's specific about Korean language, they don't have she or he or they. So they never gossip, you know? They don't gossip. They don't say he went or she came. No, this concept of the he or she. And you know, Arabic, there's he, she, they, the two they, the, you know? So, and it's sometimes this makes you think about language differently, like how everything can be a we. If you write a text of a we. In Arabic, you also have this, the two. Arabic language is very gendered language, so it's a lot, you know, it's like the German, like female, male, but in Arabic, you don't have the it, you don't have the none. The only time that there's no gender is with the two. And it's like suddenly you realize there is also how language, what it means when two people are on the side, because it's never can be the two in the center. Well, of course we are here, but we. And so the two is kind of kept for the side, on the margins. And on the margins, everything is possible. There's no need for this differentiation, it's this relation. And you feel it in Korean. I mean, sometimes it's oppressive, this we, because then what we eat, and nobody hears what you eat, what she eats, what we eat. And I get tired with time because there's always one person ordering for everybody because it's our meal. And then I kind of, okay, you see me, like, you know, I grew up in a big family, but I always wanted my place in this big family and away. And suddenly I go to Korea, and again, I'm faced with this we. And after a few months, it took actually 4 months until I understood what this we means. So there's a rotation. There's a we. This time is your turn. You decide for the we. Next time, and then they gave me my chance to decide for the we. It was amazing. They told me, now you can decide. I was like, what? Like, yeah, you say. What we gonna eat? Like, what? Yeah. And it's beautiful, this rotation. This, because we're so much used to the kind of the individualism, me against the others, but suddenly all the we, and it's kind of oppressive if it always one person decided. But if you rotate, it's almost you learning how to be in the position of the other. And I wonder if language does that when we say we. Yeah.
There are all these interesting, like in German, the word for guilt and debt is the same word. And in Bosnian, I think right and betray is the same word. Is that right? Someone told me this yesterday, Lana Bastistic. So if that's incorrect, it's her fault. That's not our fault, but her fault. But are there any words in Arabic which do double duty that way, in which they're sort of functioning in two ways, you know, where they can have double meaning. Like in English, the word harbor can mean two things. It can be sort of it can be a safe harbor, like a part of an ocean, but you can also harbor and hide something, and it's a totally different shade of the word. And are there things in Arabic which have that sort of meaning, which allow you room as a writer using the language to play with it? Because it obviously would be invisible to us here because we're reading this in translation.
Yeah, I mean, and Arabic is a crazy language, and really, going back to as kids. So as kids, at the school, they brought a religious teacher who really was not interested in teaching religion, and he was like letting us decide what we want. And then one time we asked him, teacher, look at Judaism. It's so great. Like, Moses comes and he opens the sea, and it's like, there's all these miracles. And in Christianity, Jesus comes and there's the dead, and he makes the dead alive. And what happens in Islam? There's nothing miracle, teacher, in Islam. He said, oh, but there's the Quran, and the Quran is in Arabic. And for him, Arabic is the miracle, and it's really, lots of people relate to Arabic language is a miracle. And suddenly, with time, you realize the fascination with this language by those writers. Like, if you go to Abu al-Ala al-Ma'ari, like this writer from the 10th century, and how he can, in the same word, there's one line of poetry like this, say, which means when the water flows, it shapes the stone. So this is like, sometimes you have the same word that has so many different meanings in the same way, and you can construct it. And this was very important because there's a lot with the thing with the language. It's something that you don't carry physically. It's something that with you and your imagination and this game with that. And I think poetry, old Arabic poetry, is playing with that. And you have these dictionaries, so I work a lot with that. And there are certain words that in the translation we couldn't. Translators, we should confess, they are badly paid. I can spend 12 years on writing this book, but a translator cannot spend 12 years, working on that. And sometimes you give up. I don't expect that everything should be there, but it is important in this book that how the words, they change their meaning, not because of a different context, but because of a movement in time. So, we're talking about the howl of a dog, so what it means, and then, or the checkpoint, how this checkpoint also has in Arabic, it's a stopping moment, but it's also a passage, a ma'bar, and abur and ibra. It's like, so these words, they have so many. Just change a little bit of of abur and ibra. It's like a lesson, and the opposite of a lesson. It's like something that checks you, examines you. And you accept that this is impossible, but it's not a problem. I'm sure, like within the translation, there is other things, other games that can be there. Yeah.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then maybe anyone has any questions of ADANIA. The two sections of this book are connected psychologically by these leitmotifs that are in both. There's a dog in both sections. There's the smell of petrol. In the first section, the girl is deliced with petrol, which seems like a very brutal way to delice someone. And then in the second section, this woman gets petrol on her. There's a few other things. Sand, water appears, and I'm curious if, as a writer, you have to be careful not to know too well the image map of your unconscious, because it feels very natural. It feels like they've been projected from one side of the book onto the other and not sort of neatly kind of placed as keys or symbols. But I wonder, you've been writing now for well over 20 years, and you've described in your own words the sort of witchy Arabic language. But I wonder how you feel about knowing the images your unconscious speaks in, and how you can kind of not manage them too much.
Actually, I don't manage them, and I try to keep my distance. I mean, I know that when I write, it's almost, it might also sound a bit spooky, but it's really, I almost forget, you disappear as a person. I think it's a very interesting process of writing that I think that if I keep conscious, being conscious of myself, that's the worst writing I can produce. It's amazing how bad I can be when I remember I am there in the writing. It's like I can be the worst. I look, oh my goodness, what a horror. I think the writing really happens. It's almost like as if language revealing itself, and it's inviting, words inviting themselves. It's something I cannot point to. It's a frightening process because it happens so much away of my control and awareness that I feel sometimes it's how it's possible. Like it's like a coincidence, like almost like a lottery, because I don't feel like I'm in control of it. And each time I'm afraid when, like, what happens? So each time when I go to a text, I am in complete unawareness. It's like, yeah, like vaguely there's like this kind of something in the fog, but it's never, and the fog and the far away, but it's never, it's almost this distant light that tells you you will not be lost. I'm there for you, but it doesn't tell you anything how you reach. It just comes in its own. It's a fascinating, it's a process that I'm too shy to speak about it because it's a bit embarrassing to describe it, to describe this power of language over me, but it's the truth. I don't know how these texts appear, or I don't know. It's the others. I'm just like, probably I hear it some others and they come suddenly because I just, withdraw from life, and yeah.
Well, it operates, this book, like a spell. I mean, I was just talking to someone who just started it today and read 50 pages, sort of being sucked into this environment. And whatever you're doing, don't stop. It's working. But does anyone have a question for Adania about what we've, yes, Adisa.
So two very short questions. First is, do you write literature exclusively in Arabic or also in other languages? And back to naming your son, how did you do that? Was that difficult?
That was a mistake I mentioned, because this is another spooky thing. Okay, let's do my son. Well, I dreamed it. I had the dream, it's like called Sina, and we used to call him, it's his working title. It's working title. Because we didn't know a boy or a girl, and then we just kept the name. So it wasn't a dream. I didn't bother to make an effort. It was a lazy trick. And yes, I mean, you see, I'm totally in love with Arabic. I cannot commit the crime of writing fiction non-Arabic now. It's I'm actually, normally I should say I'm not a very happy person, but I'm so happy I was born in Arabic, This is a sort of like, I can jump like I get, this language. I'm actually forcing my son every day to learn 10 minutes, and yeah, he's like, come on, son, you will discover, because there's this dictionary, it's called the Tongue of Arabs. It's a dictionary from the Lisan al-Arab, from the 12th century. And it's amazing, you can read it, it's joy. And I want him one day to read it. He doesn't know, he's not here. I'm keeping this plan secret like this. Yeah.
He's just busy reading back there. It is one thing you just said makes me realize all the great writers, are in love with the language that they're working in. They may love it differently. They might have a contentious marriage. They might have a on again, off again affair, but they have this love for the language that they're working in. And I don't think you can write well without that love. Anyway, any other questions? Well, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. This is such a beautiful, incredible book. I hope you pick it up. It's way better than we could possibly describe.
No, please lower your expectations.
Yeah, it's way worse than we could possibly describe. Thank you, BuyBook. Thank you for coming. Thank you, ADANIA SHIBLI.
Thank you.